So we'll begin with some fairly basic information, but some key things to start out with. I think it's helpful just to distinguish between when we're talking about the gospel and a gospel, and some things that you might see if you're reading some books about the gospels. First of all, when we're talking about the gospel, and there is a purpose behind the lowercase g and the capital G. When we're talking about the gospel, what we're talking about is the message of salvation from new creation, or from creation to new creation, that centers on Jesus, the proclamation of what Jesus has done to save sinners. Jesus crucified and risen for us. When we're talking about the gospel, that's what we are talking about, that message that God uses to reveal himself and to save. When we're talking about a gospel with a capital G, and this is how you'll see it distinguished in scholarly literature, when we're talking about the gospel, lowercase g, a gospel, capital G, we are talking about a certain type of narrative. Of course, these four books that appear at the beginning of the New Testament. And as a type of narrative, that means that we should interpret them as narratives, as stories. But with that said, yes, they are literature, but they're not just any type of literature. There's something truly special about these stories. They are what we might call theological biographies about Jesus that are intended to save. So they're theological in the sense that while they do depict history accurately, and they do tell us what really happened in the life of Jesus and what he really said and did, they're not just intended to show us a historical account. They're intended to teach us something about God and about ourselves and about Jesus. So they're theological in that sense, but they're also special in that they're intended to save. They don't just intend to inform us. They don't just intend to teach us historically. They intend to save those who listen and those who hear it. So this is what makes the Gospels special. If we were to compare the Gospels to ancient biographies, especially Greco-Roman biographies, we would see some overlap in terms of how they present characters, how they tell us stories about people's lives. Yet they stand apart from those ancient biographies in that they're intended to save and that they are inherently theological. They teach us things, true things about God. And of course, there are four Gospels, and we talk about the collection of Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the synoptic Gospels. That's the way that we refer to those three. They're similar in content, of course. There's lots of teaching in parables in the synoptic Gospels. There's lots of healings. There's lots of exorcisms. There's a similar geographic sequence moving from Jesus' ministry in Galilee to his final week of ministry in Jerusalem. And John, of course, is different. If you've compared them, you know that John feels different. It sounds different. It tells us different stories. It gives us a different shape and understanding to Jesus's life. And that's all intentional, and we'll talk about that intention over the course of our time together. But there is even just a different sequence in it, where John kind of shows us some recurring periodic trips to Jerusalem, and he kind of centers the course of Jesus's life around those periodic visits to the city. John also has no parables. John has no exorcisms. So there's distinctive stories that John mentions for a specific reason. And in many ways, the differences between the four Gospels are the obvious result of four people in the ancient world without iPhones to record everything that Jesus said and did in the way that we often do today. It's these four men writing their own accounts of Jesus' life. And a couple of them were eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry himself. Matthew and John were each one of the 12 disciples. Mark and Luke were not among the 12 disciples, but we have it on good historical record that in church tradition that Peter is actually the eyewitness testimony for Mark. And Luke, as we'll see at the beginning of his gospel, he did lots and lots and lots of kind of ancient historical journalism and record work to make sure that everything that he's telling in his gospel is true and historically verifiable. So, whether they're eyewitnesses themselves or whether they're relying on the eyewitness testimony of others, these four gospel writers are tying these stories together for specific reasons and articulating these stories to their audience based on either their own testimony or the testimony of others. And of course, they're doing all of this under the guidance of the Spirit, writing what the Spirit is guiding them and leading them to write about the person and work of Jesus. So, having this simple kind of background information in mind, And remembering that as we read can help to explain some of the differences that we see as we read through the Gospels together. Some of those things that initially might make us say, why is this different? Why is it same story, but things are worded differently? Jesus seems to be saying something different or saying it in a different way, or characters are responding differently. Keeping this in mind, that it's 4 people writing from their own perspectives in 4 specific reasons based on their audiences and under the direction and guidance of the Spirit, can help us to be able to respond to those differences, not be embarrassed by them, and embrace them for what they're individually revealing about Jesus. 2 key texts that we can look at to discuss why specifically these Gospels are written. We've touched on this briefly already, but these 2 texts are John 20:31 and Luke 1:1-4. The first text, John says, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And then Luke 1:1-4, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." So if we look at these texts and take them one by one, first John 20:31, we can have a little bit of discussion here around these texts. What would you say is the reason why John wrote his gospel? Yes, so that his readers would believe that Jesus is Messiah. Here's this point again of they're written for the purpose of eliciting faith, so that its hearers and readers would have faith. Now, of course, John says this about his own gospel, but we can apply this principle and this purpose to all 4 of the gospels. They all have this purpose. They want their readers and listeners to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and then by believing, here's the outcome, the product of believing, it's having life in his name. Of course, this is the eternal life that the scriptures speak of. Now, there's a little bit more to discuss with Luke 1. What are some things that you notice about the purpose that Luke describes for his own gospel?
Well, I love that he thinks that order is important.
Yes, the orderliness. Yes. Yes, this is good. Yes, he's a good doctor. Yeah, Luke is an interesting character in the scriptures because we know that he's a close associate of Paul's. He includes himself through the use of the very simple first person plural pronoun we in Acts, essentially saying, I'm along with Paul in all these journeys. And he's mentioned at a few of the end of Paul's letters, so we know that they were close. And we know that Luke, as a doctor, Paul refers to him as a doctor, he did all the hard work of making sure that these stories are true, they're verifiable, they're orderly. And this is important, right, for having confidence in these accounts. Good. What else about Luke 1? Yes.
Verse 4, where it says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
Yes.
He wants them to be good. He did all this investigating so that he would have a good account of his house.
Yes. Yeah, the language, yes. The language of certainty is really important and useful, right? He wants us to have confidence. He wants us to have certainty, and it's all based on the fact that he's saying, trust me that I've verified all of these things. What I'm writing is true. You need not worry. Now it's the purpose of it all is so that you may have certainty in these things. Of course, the certainty is not just an intellectual certainty, but it corresponds to and pairs with John's purpose as well. Certainty so that it might produce faith. And as you mentioned, there is a more specific audience to Luke, this single person, Theophilus, and we don't know exactly who this person is. And this, the name in and of itself essentially means lover of God, but we don't know anything more about this person. Some scholars say that this person, because Luke is writing it specifically for him, he may be the person that essentially footed the bill for writing the gospel. He could have bought the materials. He could have essentially been the patron to pay Luke to do this. In the ancient world, what would have been kind of some grueling work to write a document this long, to go through all the process of securing materials and speaking to eyewitnesses. So that's a theory that's on the table, that this Theophilus is the one that essentially is paying for Luke to do this because he has a real interest in the person of Jesus and he wants to know. He wants to know more about him. So it's for a specific person, yet we shouldn't think that Luke is writing this only with this one person in mind. I think Luke knew that this would reach beyond this one person and that it would have essentially a global scope to it. It would reach far, far, far beyond Theophilus.
That concept of being handed down, I mean, here we are.
Yes,
26.
precisely.
To be handed down.
Yes. It has been handed down and it's continuing to be handed down. He also mentions eyewitnesses explicitly. And this is one way of him saying, I didn't see these things for myself, but I spoke with those who did. And their accounts are true and verifiable. So just from these two introductory, one's a concluding statement of these two Gospels, we see the purpose for why these Gospels were written. And again, I think both of these statements apply to all four of the Gospels, written to produce faith and written for the purpose of having certainty in the truthfulness and the verifiability, the veracity of these four Gospels. A few things to keep in mind as we read the Gospels in this larger category of how the Gospels work. The Gospels are meant not simply to inform us about Jesus' life, but also, and I would say primarily, to shape who we are and the way that we live as disciples of Jesus. Rather than telling us what to do or how to live, the Gospels show us what to do or how to live through the actions of its characters. So it's more of a showing us what to do rather than coming right out and telling us what to do. For example, rather than telling us that Peter is quick-tempered, the Gospels tell us the story of Peter cutting off the high priest's servant's ear when Jesus was being arrested. Rather than telling us that Jesus was kind to women and children, the Gospels tell us the story of Jesus interacting with the woman at the well, and the story of Jesus raising the widow of Nain's son in Luke 7, and the story of Jesus welcoming children to himself and rebuking his disciples when they said, "Get these kids away." So the Gospel writers don't come right out and tell us Jesus was kind to women and children. Peter was a quick-tempered, at sometimes foolish man. They tell us stories to show us those things. And while the Gospels do follow a general chronological progression from Jesus' birth or the early part of his ministry to his death and resurrection, they are not strictly chronological, but rather they're arranged more topically or thematically. There is a general chronological progression, yet the Gospel writers use their authorial freedom to go out of order in some ways, temporally and chronologically, because they're seeking to highlight specific things. And the order in which they put stories actually highlights certain things about Jesus's character. And one way to illustrate this is to compare a sequence of stories that is similar yet not exactly the same across the synoptic gospels. So the ordering that I'm following here in this chart is in Matthew's account, going from Matthew 8:1 down to 9:13 in this sequence of 8 stories. Notice Mark begins much sooner in his gospel with these stories. And then the second story, the healing of the centurion's servant, Mark doesn't mention that. And then the third story, Mark actually mentions before where Matthew places that. And then he follows a similar order. And then we skip to chapter 4, where Mark has the stilling of the storm, whereas Matthew puts that all together in this collection of stories. So there's a gap in the way that Mark presents it. And then we have the healing of the Gadarene demoniac in Mark 5, but then the healing of the paralytic comes in chapter 2, whereas in Matthew, he keeps it in this different sequence of stories. We can do the same type of analysis with Luke, where there's even more back and forth in the precise location of these stories. And this is part of what we'll talk about here in a minute with the author's freedom in the authorial design of our Gospels. they have the freedom to shape these stories, and in the shaping and the sequencing of individual stories or episodes, it's actually revealing different emphases about who Jesus is and what he's accomplishing in these moments in his ministry. So it's a simple illustration to show us that it's not so much chronological as it is topical or thematic in its structure. Now, this next section we'll be in for a little while as we talk about how we should interpret the Gospels. And there are two big umbrella categories that I think are helpful for distinguishing when we're thinking about authorial design and Jesus's teaching. And as I'll reiterate, of course, the Gospel author is the one who is overseeing this entire process, who's the one who's in control, of course, always led by the Spirit, yet the Gospel author is the one that is putting things into his own voice, shaping the story for his own specific emphases and purposes. But we'll take each one of these in turn and explore them a bit more. Sequencing is what we just talked about with the chart, where the gospel writers arrange and sequence stories in certain regions to emphasize particular aspects of Jesus's identity. And when we zoom out and consider more than just one story at a time, but several stories in sequence, we can begin to understand what the gospel writer is trying to communicate by where he has placed certain stories in his gospel. A really fun exercise to do this with is if you go from Luke 3 to Luke 9, there's a very tight emphasis on one dimension of Jesus's character, and it's his power. Story after story is highlighting different elements of his power. And as you work through those chapters, you see that Luke is intentionally highlighting different dimensions of Jesus' power, beginning with Jesus' power over sickness, but then moving into Jesus' power over the demonic world, moving into Jesus' power over death itself with the raising of the widow of Nain's son, into Jesus' power over nature with the stilling of the storm. So Luke has sequenced these stories for the reason of showing Jesus is powerful, but he's powerful in ways that bend and break all of our expectations for what we're used to in the natural world. That's how sequencing can shape the way that we understand who Jesus is and what he has done in a gospel. Next is characters. This type of analysis will probably be familiar to us because we know that characters carry out the action and move the plot forward in a story. Typically, the point that the author wants to make is tied to the actions of one or more of the characters in the story. And typically, what our gospel authors, and the point that they want to make is tied to what Jesus is doing and saying and how he is responding in a story. As in real life and in the Old Testament, characters in the Gospels are complex. And as readers, we rarely know all that we want to know about the characters in the story. Of course, we are left at the mercy of what the Gospel authors tell us about these characters, even though we may want to know so much more. Story. And rather than telling us how characters behave and change, the narrator shows us, again, showing us through story. For example, John doesn't tell us that Jesus can raise the dead. Instead, he shows us with the story of Jesus raising Lazarus. So when we begin to look at individual gospel stories, it will be helpful for us to track the characters, see how they develop in any given story, and see how the author is making specific points about what he wants to show us, what he wants to draw out, what he wants to emphasize in the story through the characters. Now, on to plot. I've given you this on the handout to help you visualize this. We're all familiar with plot and how it works, even if that's kind of a subconscious familiarity and knowledge, because this is how all stories work. Plot refers to how the story is framed and organized by the author. And there are 5 components of a story's plot that we can identify. The first is the setting, which gives us the background material that's essential for understanding a story. And this is how every little episode begins. It's almost always some type of mention of who's there and where it's taking place. And oftentimes with the Gospels, there's some type of kind of transition statement of after this happened, Jesus went into a new place, or something like that. There's some type of transition cue that signals that a new story is starting, a new episode is starting, and there's a new setting for this next part. And this is the material that is helpful for us as readers to get us up to speed with understanding the basic components of what's going on, who's involved, where's it taking place, what's happening here. And then we have rising conflict. These are the early stages of narrative action. Typically, the bulk of the story is going to consist of rising conflict because chances are the climax and resolution are going to be saved toward the end. And the author is kind of building up to that moment, showing us why there's tension building, showing us why there's suspense, showing us why there's conflict in any given story. And all of this is signaling the direction that the plot will take us as we work toward the climax. And it often stems from the decisions or the mistakes or the actions of the key characters that are involved in a given story. And then we get to climax. This is where the plot reaches its the point of its highest moment of tension. And it's with climax and resolution are very closely paired. Climax is when the tension is at its highest, and resolution is right when that tension is broken or resolved in some way in the story. So resolution is the presentation of the solution to the story's conflict. So whether it's an argumentation that Jesus has with the Jewish religious leaders, oftentimes there's tension building, and Jesus's kind of final response is the resolution to whatever he's being posed in that moment. Or if it's a healing story, of course, the rising action is the problem of the person's plight, whether it's that they're paralytic or they're sick in some way. And then the resolution is the moment when Jesus helps them and restores them and brings them back to their prior state. And then following action. Not every story has following action. Sometimes gospel writers just kind of end with that resolution moment and move right on to the next story. But when we do have following action, this is where the author is tying up loose ends and sending the characters on some type of new trajectory. So if we're thinking about the Gospel of Matthew, the Great Commission is a great moment of the following action, where, of course, Jesus commissions his disciples, and that's Jesus kind of sending them on a new direction, giving them a new mission. And of course, Matthew doesn't tell us what happens beyond that, but this is the moment where there is resolution because Jesus has been risen from the dead, and now he's tying up these loose ends. Well, what's he going to say to his disciples after he meets with them, especially with this tension that he's had with Peter, who has denied him 3 times? What's going to happen? Well, notably in the Great Commission, Jesus doesn't even mention that. He's forgiven, he's moved on, there's something new at hand. So he sends them off with this new mission of taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. And we can think about plot on both a macro and a micro level in the Gospels. Most stories have an identifiable plot line. So every individual episode has a plot. We can think of that as kind of the micro plot. But even the Gospels, every individual Gospel as a whole has a plot, and we can chart that plot. Of course, the moment of climax and resolution in all 4 of the Gospels revolves around the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And most things in between, or before that moment of the cross, is rising action. So we can think of it on that macro and micro level. Now, not every story will fit perfectly into a plot arc. Some stories are not intended to really follow a plot arc. There's a really good example in the crucifixion scene of Jesus. Of course, there's tension building in that moment, but what Mark seems to be doing more than anything is comparing the responses to Jesus in this moment. And of course, you get the stark contrast between what the Roman centurion says of Jesus, truly this is the Son of God, versus the religious leaders who are constantly mocking and ridiculing Jesus. So yes, we could identify plot there, but it seems like Mark is even more than showing us the plot, is showing us this contrast in responses to Jesus as he hangs on the cross. And then finally, for authorial design, we must keep in mind the perspective of the author. The gospel author is the one who's responsible for the stories that are told, selecting those stories, sequencing those stories in a certain way, telling those stories in a certain way, and he's therefore responsible for, in part, conveying meaning through these stories. In other words, the stories are told from their perspective, which makes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just use scare quotes, omniscient in this way with respect to the information about the characters of the story. So again, yes, the historical accuracy, that doesn't therefore mean that they're not interpreted. They are interpreted stories. They are filtered stories that are told for a specific reason. I think there's a helpful analogy here where we can think of the gospel writers as the directors of a movie set, where they're behind the scenes and they can see everything that's going on. Yet we, as the viewer of the movie, we only see where the camera takes us, whatever perspective that camera gives us. Yet those who are behind the scenes, like the director, they see everything that's happening outside of the frame that we see. So in the analogy, the gospel writers are the directors. They know everything else that is going on, yet they're intentionally only giving us a portion of the action so that they might reveal something about Jesus. And occasionally, gospel writers will kind of present themselves in the story in some type of way of commenting on the story, kind of an authoritative voice describing and explaining what's going on. John is really good at this and very helpful in this way because he'll emerge in the narrative and tell us why things are happening. A good example of this is in John 2:11, where after telling the story of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana, John says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So we should always be looking for those places where the author is kind of coming into the story and telling us these kind of authoritative interpretations on what is happening. Those are always helpful moments because they're helping us to see what the author wants us to focus on in the story. And that's ultimately what we should be focusing on as well. Okay, so we can do a little bit of practice together here. This is a good story to do this with. This is Peter's conversion in Luke's account, and we can explore some of these aspects of authorial perspective together. Luke says, one day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up to shore, left everything, and followed him.
There was tension too, because he immediately responds and says, "We worked all night. We haven't caught anything."
Yes.
He wasn't challenging him, but he's like, "Hey, look." And then he says, "But because you say so, I will do it."
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where interpretation is fun because you could read this and say, but because of the details that Luke gives us, and one kind of interpretive principle is pay close attention to the details, especially the things that aren't necessary to the story. I like to always ask the question, what's mentioned here that isn't actually necessary to the basic building blocks of the plot, but are just helpful for understanding the tone and the attitude and the perspectives of the people involved in the story. And one of those is the fact that Peter, they've been fishing all night long. Of course, we could get the interaction with Jesus and Peter without knowing that they've been fishing all night long. Peter at this point is probably very tired, frustrated, at his wit's end, to where someone comes along and says, "Just try one more time." And he's probably like, "Whatever. Okay, I'll give it a shot." Probably not, he's not thinking that anything is actually going to happen, that this is actually going to produce any significant results. But he's tired, he doesn't have the energy to put up a fight. So he just listens to Jesus. Yes.
He didn't need to know that the boats belonged to Simon. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon.
Yes, another detail that's it always causes us to ask the question: why does he mention this?
Yeah.
And-
Something they were Simon's partners.
Yes, yeah, they're partners, and what becomes significant is these are the three disciples of Jesus's inner ring of disciples, the ones that get taken on the Mount of Transfiguration. If it's any three that are found with Jesus in a special moment, it's these three. So Luke is kind of letting us know from the beginning that these three are going to have an important place in Jesus' ministry. Yes.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, at the context. So usually when people teach about this, they focus on the call of Peter and
Mm-hmm.
how the significance of Peter.
Yeah.
But this time I was like, that the crowd is a character, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the reason he went out. And so it's the context of that story is the parallel. It's what he's teaching Peter and the rest of them. Like, so there's a crowd, and he's like, okay, there's a lot of people. They can
Mm-hmm.
all see the needs aren't being met. I need to go to a place where there's visibility. And then what he does is he teaches. And then when he's done teaching, then he said, okay, go put out your net. And so for the people in the boat with him, it's this, like, it's a circumstantial, like, this is how I'm going to make you fishers of men. Like, that's what he's showing them what that means
Mm-hmm.
by saying, like, there's going to be so many fish, you can't handle it. Go call your friends. Now you be my disciples in the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just never saw that before. And yeah, so like interpreting the answer, how do you interpret it? Like the showing, like you were saying, like showing the story and the parallel, and like for the people in the moment, it's the circumstantial way that he's like teaching.
Yeah. 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 That's great. That's really helpful. And that's, of course, he mentions people crowding around, and this would make up the setting of the story, showing us who's here, who's involved. And we can't kind of leave that behind. That, of course, influences what's going on here and why it's important. That's good.
I also like that Simon Peter says, well, after all this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go
Mm-hmm.
away from me, sinful man.
Yeah.
Then he calls him, so to me, it's also showing the gospel. Like, he's being called, he's a sinful man, yet Jesus is called
Yes.
out of that
Yes.
to make fishers. So for me, it's like, yeah, you don't have to be cleaned up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And this is, as we'll see in the questions that I have for as you're reading, just questions to help interpret these stories, this is really getting at the question of what does this individual story show us about Jesus, help us better understand about Jesus, and what does it help us better understand about ourselves? And this is,
Conviction right away.
yeah.
Yeah.
Whoa, get away. I'm worthy. Yeah, right.
Yes.
Holy ground, whatever.
Yeah. And with Peter's response, the entire story is important. All the details are important. But what I think Luke is really drawing our attention to more than anything is this conversation between Jesus and Peter.
Fell on his knees.
He falls at his knees. His response to Jesus is very important. And we'll get to how the sequencing helps us to see that here in a moment. But the story in and of itself, the miracle of the catch is wonderful and amazing and tremendous in and of itself. But it seems like what Luke is saying is this is essentially a means to an end. The miracle of the catch is intended to get Peter's attention and to draw him in.
What do you think Peter was afraid of? Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid.
Yes. Yes, it seems like in this moment, Peter has a recognition that someone far greater than him, who knows him inside and out, is right in front of him and could very well judge him harshly in this moment. So it seems like he's got this kind of holy fear of, I'm in the midst of someone that is far greater than me, and he knows everything about me, and yet, of course, the ultimate response of Jesus, now you will fish for people. This is,
He knows ultimately that he's going to get charged for every fish he bought, right? I mean, the tax collectors, isn't he going to have to pay for his catch?
yes,
I wonder if there's a fear in the fact that the whole 2 boats are loaded with fish.
yes. Now, the interesting thing is,
It doesn't tell us that.
yes, they leave everything behind and follow him. So maybe maybe that Peter's like, well, I did just have this tremendous catch, but this guy's worth following more than my occupation at the moment. And this is just interesting to see how all the gospels tie together. In John's gospel, in the post-resurrection account in John 21, what's Peter doing after Jesus is raised from the dead? He and John are out fishing again. They take up their occupation again in this in-between time where they're not really sure what to do, where they know Jesus is risen from the dead, yet they are kind of waiting for the promise of the Spirit. So it's just interesting to see how all of these things connect. But yes, I think the miracle of the catch is very important, and it's revealing something about Jesus in and of itself, Jesus' power over the natural world. Yet, it's ultimately serving a greater purpose in this story of drawing Peter in so that he can send him out. And I think that's what Luke is trying to accomplish. And with where he places it in his gospel, I think we can see that all the more, because this is, with where Luke puts it, right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, where Jesus has been tested in the wilderness at the beginning of Luke 4, and then he's rejected at Nazareth. This is kind of his first public demonstration of who he is after he's tested in the wilderness by Satan. And then Jesus drives out an impure spirit, he heals many, and then it's the call of Peter. So Jesus is kind of building his disciples at the beginning of his ministry, and essentially setting this moment sets the tone for what his disciples will be all about. It's fishing for men. And then, right after that, Jesus continues on in his healing ministry. So that's the way it's presented. Yes, yes.
It really stands out to me how the authority of Jesus really pierced Peter's heart
Mm-hmm.
when he saw the miracle that happened.
Yes, yes,
Otherwise, why would he, he wouldn't have reacted that way if he wasn't really recognizing that this is either a prophet or, like you said, someone much higher than me with much more authority than me.
yes.
So I just find that amazing, amazing work of God in Peter's life
Mm-hmm.
to respond that way, and James and John, and the fact that they all just left
Yeah.
their careers
Mm-hmm.
in that moment.
Yeah.
Just find the whole story amazing.
Yeah, and that's kind of where it really hits home for us, is they leave everything behind and follow him. And that's, of course, the call of discipleship.
Would
Yes.
they have the knowledge of, everybody telling the story of the Messiah coming, that even at that point, Peter might have thought, whoa, this is not just a prophet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it seems like, from what we can tell, that the average Jewish person in the first century would have been familiar with, they would have had at least an expectation of what the Messiah would be, not necessarily what he would look like, but the things that he would stand for. Now,
It's coming.
yes, they would have been longing for him to come, and they would have expected it to be a person, at least someone who looks like a person, kind of indistinguishable from just an average person. So they would have been longing for this, yet, as we'll see, they have a different expectation than what Jesus actually fulfills in his messianic ministry, where they expect someone who's going to be a conquering king, someone to come in and throw out Rome and kind of establish Israel as an independent, sovereign political entity once again. But of course, Jesus' ministry is not so much focused on that as it is focused on establishing the kingdom, which is a spiritual kingdom, not an earthly kingdom.
Just a sidebar, how kind of Jesus to make sure that if Zebedee's getting left with the whole fishing deal, he's got a bunch of fish.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it's true. Jesus,
Everything.
yeah.
And follow Jesus. So there's Zebedee with his boats and his fish and a lot of them.
Yeah, so this is a helpful point of what may be implied. It's not explicit. What's explicit is there is a major catch. But what may be implied is some kind of subtle point on Jesus' provision and the way that he can provide above and beyond. And we see that, of course, more explicitly in things like the feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000. But that could be emphasized here as well. Yes. This is wonderful. I love the way that y'all are engaging with the text. This is great. All right, good example there. Now let's look at Jesus' teaching. Of course, we'll engage with Jesus' teaching significantly next week when we look at the Sermon on the Mount. There are 4 dimensions of Jesus' teaching that are worth mentioning at this point. First is exaggeration. Exaggeration occurs when a truth is overstated for the sake of effect. Of course, Jesus is a master teacher, and he often uses exaggeration to connect with his listeners and to drive home his point. So a famous example of exaggeration in Jesus' teaching is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:29, when he says, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away." Now imagine the awful implications if everyone took that seriously. We would all be walking around with no eyes. So Jesus didn't intend this to be taken literally, as if everyone should actually do this. So we mustn't force a literal interpretation of everything that we see in this way, because if we do, we'll ultimately miss the real point of the teaching. Now, at the same time, we should still take Jesus' teaching very seriously and not water it down to the point where it has no significance or meaning for us today. But understanding when Jesus is exaggerating will be important for understanding the precise point that he's driving home in those moments. Next feature is metaphor and simile. A metaphor is the application of a word or phrase to something that it does not naturally apply. And the simile functions in the same way, only it uses the words like or as to clarify the association in the comparison. Famous metaphors in Jesus' teaching include, "You are the salt of the earth," when he's talking to his disciples. Of course, they aren't literally salt, but he's making a metaphor based on what salt does and what his disciples are intended to do in their ministry. "I am the bread of life." Of course, Jesus isn't actually bread, but he's making a comparison based on what bread provides, how it sustains, and how he, as the eternal Lord, provides and sustains. Famous similes include, "You are like whitewashed tombs," when he's speaking to the Pharisees, and when he tells his disciples that they need to be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And the key to interpreting these metaphors and similes is to discern the intended point of the comparison. If we go back to that verse where Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs, we need to understand the significance of a whitewashed tomb in order to see how it actually applies to the Pharisees. A tomb, of course, is a place that houses the dead. So if a tomb is whitewashed on the outside, then it has a clean external appearance, but on the inside, it houses death. Something that's clean on the outside, but decaying and rotten on the inside. So Jesus' point, if that then applies to the Pharisees, is that they have a clean external appearance. From the onlooker, they're doing all the right things and saying all the right things and living a holy and religious life. But on the inside, there's nothing but spiritual death and decay. And then we have rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are designed to make a point rather than to receive an answer. Jesus frequently uses rhetorical questions to make strong statements in creative ways. Some of his well-known rhetorical statements include, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Do you think I came to bring peace on earth?" So, of course, in most cases, the answer to the rhetorical question is obvious, and he's not intending to actually have his listeners respond to him, yet he's making a strong point. And one helpful way to interpret rhetorical questions is simply to turn them into statements. So for the first one, again, "If you love those who love you, you will get no reward. Or you will not gain anything. You will not add a single hour to your life by worrying. Why are you so afraid? You do not have faith. I did not come to bring peace on earth." And then finally, we have parables. Parables are the most common way in which Jesus teaches, yet parables can be quite difficult at times to interpret. Sometimes it can seem, if you've heard preaching on parables, one preacher draws this point from the parable, another preacher draws another point from a parable. One focuses on some things, the other another. So parables are difficult, but a very simple definition of a parable is that it's a story with intent. It's a story that is rooted in Jesus's first century Jewish culture. That's why we have so many agricultural parables, because they're drawing from the time and the space and the location and the people of Jesus's first century Jewish context. So they're rooted and historical in that sense. And they're meant to be short stories that make a point, short stories that teach us something. And we'll have a week that we focus more specifically on parables, and I'll give you some more guidelines for how to interpret parables on that week. But generally, they're stories with intent. They're teaching us something, most often about the kingdom of God, either what the kingdom is, the people that comprise the kingdom, what the kingdom's values are, or the God of the kingdom. In some way, they're teaching us something about the kingdom, but typically with the parables, there's also a call to respond in a certain way, whether it's just simply believe in Jesus as the one who is represented in the parable, or whether it's to change the way that we live. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. No matter how we interpret it, of course, there's a call to love our neighbor in that parable. There's often some type of challenge or push to us as its listeners to change the way that we live, to bring our lives into greater alignment with the way that God would intend for us to live. Yes?
Parables are an earthly story with a heavenly meaning.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a helpful definition there. An earthly story. They tell the stories of everyday life in the ancient world, yet they have a heavenly meaning. They have a spiritual meaning that we're meant to see and respond to in some way. Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. Any questions thus far? Okay. Below that on your handouts, I've given you some questions to ask when interpreting gospel narratives. We don't need to go through all of those point by point. I think I've explained all of them in one way or another thus far this morning, but these are helpful questions that you can use as you're reading the Gospels in this 8-week study, just to maybe see some things that you haven't seen before, or to draw your attention to different details in the text. And that can be just a really enlightening exercise to go into the text with certain questions and topics in mind.
Great outline.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Now, for the last 30 minutes, let's talk about the genealogies. A fitting place to start, week 1 of a gospel study. Where did Jesus come from, at least in his earthly existence? So first, as we often do, us professors, we need to define our terms and begin with the basic things. What is a genealogy? Well, we're all familiar, at least in a general sense, that a genealogy is a record of a person's descent, their ancestral descent. And there are 2 types of genealogies that we see in the New Testament, and this isn't essential for understanding their meaning, but just showing their differences. Luke's, we would call it a descending genealogy because it begins with the person that it's all about and descends down to another person, moving from the present to an earlier time. And then you have an ascending genealogy, like Matthew's, which moves from an earlier time to the present. It's ascending up to the present time. And there isn't necessarily one strict purpose for a genealogy, but genealogies do extend beyond simply and purely just giving us someone's ancestral descent. At least the biblical genealogies are intended to do more than that. And they're not always intended to preserve a strict ancestral descent. So the biblical authors, Matthew and Luke especially, have the freedom to skip generations or to mention different people that are involved in Jesus's family because they're trying to highlight certain things about Jesus's identity. They're constructed to show identity and duty, to demonstrate credentials for power, and to structure history around an individual. A lot of the genealogies that we see, especially in the later Old Testament books, are the genealogies of kings. And this is in one way intended to show why they are fit for king, because they come from a royal line, or to show that there's a specific identity or duty that this person has based on who has come before them. Or, as we'll see, it's a way of kind of structuring history, shaping the way that we view history around this certain individual. Overall, the genealogies in the Bible, all of the genealogies, but especially these genealogies in the New Testament, address the question of who are the people of God? Who are the people of God and where do they come from? Yeah, sure. Yes.
Okay, so is this specifically for the New Testament and how like the merging, is that like a big difference? Because I thought the Hebrew was orders,
Mm.
which I don't, how does identity and duty apply to like these are the orders in the heavens and the earth?
Yes. So all of these apply to the New Testament genealogies. Some of these descriptions apply to Old Testament genealogies as well. So there is a little bit of overlap. In general, with the New Testament genealogies, it's a genealogy in the sense of someone's beginning and where they came from. You mentioned orders as being kind of the translation of Old Testament. There is kind of an orderliness to the presentation of someone's ancestry, but there is a different word that's being used there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of how a genealogy works, of course, it tells a story through the names that are mentioned. And each name that a genealogy mentions, ultimately, what happens for us as readers is evokes the entire network of that person's stories in the Bible. So if Abraham is mentioned, as he is in Matthew's genealogy at the very beginning, for us as readers, what that does is it evokes all of Genesis 12 through 25, where Abraham is mentioned. So with each individual mentioned, it's essentially this massive network of biblical stories that shape and inform the way that we view the person that the genealogy is all about. So by tracing the ancestry of Jesus to Abraham and Adam, Matthew and Luke are evoking this massive network of stories that ultimately spans the entire Old Testament, thus relating Jesus' birth to the story of all of God's people. Now, there are differences between Matthew and Luke's genealogy, just beyond the direction in which they flow. Of course, we've talked about that direction. Matthew's is ascending, Luke's is descending. There's also a difference of location. Matthew's is at the very beginning of his gospel. Luke, interestingly, doesn't put it at the very beginning of his gospel. Instead, he puts it in chapter 3. And we'll talk about why Luke situates it there. There's a difference of extent. Matthew doesn't trace his all the way back to Adam. He traces it back to Abraham, which is intentional. We'll talk about that. Whereas Luke reaches all the way back to Adam. There is an organization difference. Matthew's is segmented and royal, focusing on David's royal line. Luke's is linear and not so much focused on this kingly Davidic line. And the fork in the road occurs at David. If you compare them, and to compare them, you kind of have to work in opposite directions since they flow differently, but the fork in the road occurs at David. Before David in Matthew and after David in Luke, the names are mostly the same. But once you get to David, Matthew follows the line of Solomon, the kingly line, while Luke follows the line of another one of David's sons, Nathan. And that's what accounts for a lot of the differences before or after David, depending on which direction you're moving in. So that, again, is highlighting something about what these two authors are wanting us to see about Jesus' identity. Something slightly different, yet both are meaningful and complementary. And then you have the difference of inclusion, specifically around the inclusion of women. Matthew includes women in his genealogy, and Luke does not. Luke highlights the value and place of Jesus, or place of women in Jesus' ministry in different ways. He, more than anyone, tells stories of women and holds them up as models of faith throughout his gospel. So it's not as if by not mentioning women in his genealogy that Luke is saying that women aren't really involved in the bringing forth of Jesus and his heritage, but he highlights their value and distinctiveness in a different way. And then you have the difference of Joseph's father. This is perhaps what more critical scholars will point to and say, see, this is where things are not totally accurate. This is where the biblical authors make mistakes. But rest assured, there's a very sufficient explanation that shouldn't shake our confidence in the Gospels. Of course, the difference is in the names of Joseph's father. Matthew records Jacob as the name of Joseph's father. Luke records Heli as the name of Joseph's father. And that can be explained sufficiently in one of two ways. Either we have a case of adoption here, where Jacob and Heli are brothers. One brother dies, and the other brother adopts his kids, which would have been a fairly standard practice. And that would have included Joseph, to where Joseph would have it would have made one brother the biological father of Joseph, the other the legal father of Joseph by adoption. So whether it's Matthew, whether it's Heli, it could be a simple case of adoption. Or similarly, but with a slightly different kind of expectation, we could have the explanation of Levirate marriage, which we see in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Ruth. This is illustrated very well. Jacob and Heli are brothers in the situation. One brother dies and left no male heirs, and the living brother marries his deceased brother's widow and raises up an heir for the deceased brother. So it's similar to adoption, except it follows more strictly the practice of Levirate marriage. So we don't know in either case which brother died, which one would have done the adopting. We don't know, but those are sufficient explanations one way or the other of why there are different fathers mentioned for Joseph in the two genealogies. Now, Matthew's genealogy has a certain shape, and this is what makes it distinctive and special, at least part of what makes it distinctive and special. There's kind of you can think of it as kind of mountaintops and valleys based on Israel's history. Matthew builds up from Abraham to David. Of course, Abraham is the beginning of the people of Israel. He's the one who is considered righteous because he believes in the promise that despite being very old and not having any kids, that God will give him a son. So the people of Israel, people of God, begin with Abraham. You build up to this moment in Israel's history in the first kind of set of 14 generations in Matthew's genealogy up to David, which is kind of the crowning moment of ancient Israel's history, where things are at their best. The chosen royal one is on the throne and things are going well. But then, of course, toward the end of David's life, things spiral into chaos, and that ultimately leads the people into exile. So in the second set of 14 generations, Matthew works from David down to Israel's low point in its history, in exile. But then, coming out of exile, you build up to the ultimate moment in Israel's history with the birth of its Messiah. So Matthew builds his genealogy on these sets of 14 generations, showing the high points and the low points of Israel's history. Luke, on the other hand, just works straight down the line, from Jesus to Adam. Notice there's no segmenting, there's no breaking up of the generations. There are no literary devices that kind of section out certain portions for us in the way that Matthew's does. It's just a straightforward, linear account. Yet there's a lot of distinctives that come along with that as well. It may not be as sophisticated, at least structurally, as Matthew's, but there's a purpose in doing it this way. Now, as for what makes each one significant, we can talk about these three different types of significance. Both of them have numerical significance, so let's start with Matthew's. In Matthew's day, unlike ours, the significance of something could be conveyed through numbers. For us, numbers are just numbers. They're just data. They're statistics, whatever they may be. But in Matthew's day, in the ancient world, in the Jewish world, and in the early Christian world, numbers had great significance. And we see this in Matthew's genealogy. Matthew constructs his genealogy in three sections of 14 generations, and both of those numbers are significant. The number 3 represents completion. But why 14? What's so significant about the number 14? Well, I'm sure that Dr. Thigpen could do a much better job of explaining this than I could, but the number 14, if you take the consonants in David's name, they each have a numerical value. 6, 4, and 6. You add those together, that of course is 14. Sorry, I did it backwards. 4, 6, and 4. See, I told you Dr. Thigpen would do much better than me. This is Hebrew. This is not my specialty. And more coffee, yes, that's the answer. 14. 14 generations, and you can see this with the way that Matthew, with the way that he segments it. So, the point of all of this is that 3 represents completion, 14 represents David. Matthew is signaling, even in the numbers themselves, that David's imprint is on the life of Jesus. David is the ultimate royal representative of the people of Israel. So from the very beginning, without telling us that Jesus is God's chosen and ultimate king, he demonstrates it in the numbers that he uses, in the way that he structures the genealogy of Jesus. This is brilliant. And this is what makes Matthew so, Matthew is such a careful organizer of information. We'll see this next week when we turn to him more specifically. David's imprint is on Jesus. And then we have the canonical significance of Matthew's genealogy. Our English Bible ordering is a little bit different than the Hebrew Bible ordering, at least in the Old Testament Bible ordering. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, it ends with the book of Chronicles for people, and we end the Old Testament with a list of bad Davidic kings. It's a clear signal that the good and true and wonderful and ultimate Davidic king is now here. So moving out of the Hebrew Old Testament and into the New Testament, the genealogy really functions like a bridge, going from the worst of Israel's history to the best of Israel's history in the birth of its kingly Messiah. And then you have the inclusive significance. Ancient genealogies typically trace birth through the male line exclusively, but Matthew includes 5 women in his genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. While some of these women are in some way involved in questionable behavior in the Old Testament narratives in which their stories are told, all 5 of them are vindicated in some way. And even the New Testament upholds some of them as models. The book of James, for example, upholds Rahab as a model of faith alongside Abraham. This is a tremendous and surprising thing for its readers. So all 5 of them are vindicated no matter what behavior they were involved in beforehand. And even more surprising is the fact that it's not just women, but it's also Gentile women. Most of these are Gentile women. Tamar is a Canaanite. Rahab is from Jericho. Ruth is a Moabite. Bathsheba is a Hittite by marriage. So Matthew's decision to include these women corrects the assumption, what I think would have been a historical assumption in Jesus' time, that the Messiah's lineage would be strictly Jewish, that it would be more or less kind of a pure blood line, and it anticipates the reality that the kingdom of God transcends these boundaries that we often put in place, especially in the ancient world, where women were viewed very negatively, inferior. It's breaking that boundary to where men and women are upheld and valued equally in God's kingdom, and also the boundary between Jews and Gentiles, a very clear ethnic and religious divide in the ancient world. By mentioning Gentile women, Matthew is beginning to strip away those boundaries that were in place in the ancient world.
It's interesting, he was Jewish, and to the Jews, you wouldn't think he would give that credit to the Gentile woman.
Matthew writing to Jewish, yes. Yeah, this is, Matthew does have a highly Jewish kind of tone and flavor to it, yet he very kind of carefully weaves in mentions of Gentiles throughout his gospel, like the Magi. These are Gentiles who come to Jesus from faraway lands and things. So it is highly Jewish, yet Matthew seems to be very aware that he wants to include mentions of Gentiles and how they are welcomed into this kingdom that Jesus is bringing. Yes. And then finally, Luke's genealogy, what makes it special. Luke has its own numerical significance. Luke includes 77 names, if we include God's name, in Luke 3:38. And the number 7, of course, has its own symbolic meaning. in the scriptures as the number for completion or perfection. And that 77 is a round number of 7. Luke is conveying through the number of names mentioned that Jesus represents the fullness of the people of God and is the central figure in God's plan of redemption. And then second, we have a ministerial significance to Luke's genealogy. Luke introduces his genealogy by saying Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Again, this is another one of those details where he doesn't have to mention that, yet he mentions his age. In the Old Testament, many key figures didn't begin the task that they're known for until the age of 30. Joseph began serving Pharaoh at 30. Aaron's sons couldn't enter the priesthood until they were 30, a practice that was enforced all the way through Solomon's reign. Saul and David became kings at 30. So, by stating that Jesus' ministry began when he was 30, this is a very subtle way of Luke signaling that he's now eligible, in the like of all of these important people in Israel's history, to begin his service as a priest and a king. And of course, after Luke's genealogy is when we have the temptation and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So that might hint at the significance of the placement in chapter 3 instead of at the beginning of chapter 1, because it's a fitting moment to say that Jesus is now fit to serve as a priest and as a king of God's people. Of course, not that he wasn't those things before, but in the demonstration of that in the public sphere, he's now eligible. And then finally, there's a universal significance to Luke's genealogy. Luke's decision to trace Jesus' ancestry back to Adam fits perfectly with his emphasis in his gospel on the universal applicability of the gospel. And by that I mean Luke is careful to include women and outcasts and those who have been forgotten and cast off in society. Luke shows how Jesus draws them into his ministry and draws them in to the kingdom. And this has at least 4 important implications. By going all the way back to Adam, it's a way of showing that Jesus is human. He traces it back to the first man, showing that Jesus is in likeness with him in some way in his humanity. Second, it implies that Jesus is the Savior of all of humanity, not just Israel. By going all the way back to Adam, you can't claim that Jesus just came to save his people. No, he came to save both Jews and Gentiles. Third, it implies that with the incarnation, with the birth of Jesus, comes a new beginning for the people of God, because Adam represents the beginning of man. With Jesus represents a new beginning, a new stage in the history of God's people. And fourth, it sets up a parallel between Adam and Jesus that raises the question of Jesus' obedient sonship. And here's where I think the real key is to why Luke places it in chapter 3. Because right after he mentions son of Adam, son of God, you get Jesus being tested in the wilderness. Who do we know was tested in a similar place in the scriptures? Adam and Eve. So Luke is very carefully turning up the tension and the suspense in the narrative to say, at this moment, I've told you about the story of Jesus' miraculous virgin birth. But he's the son of Adam. Is he going to live like Adam and fail and thus not prove himself to be the eligible and right and fitting priest and king that we've been longing for? Or is he going to succeed where Adam failed and be the good and true and wonderful and ultimate king and priest that we've been longing for? So it's in this moment of Jesus being tested in the wilderness, which Adam signals this connection and wants to draw our minds to the parallels with Adam in this moment by mentioning Adam at the end of the genealogy, to where he's saying this is an important kind of decisive moment in Jesus' ministry. If he succeeds, then he proves that he is the fitting Messiah who will save God's people from their sins. If he fails, then we continue to look for another. But thankfully, and of course, he succeeds. And it ultimately leads to his death and resurrection. And that ultimately leads to us being here together right now, still studying these wonderful Gospels together.